Good evening. We will talk about the Mafia, not the one that flashes in Hollywood films with beautiful costumes and noble godfathers, but the real one, the one that was born out of poverty and fear, grew on blood and silence, and turned into one of the most powerful criminal empires in the history of mankind. This is a story about how a handful of Sicilian peasants created a system that survived wars, dictatorships, and revolutions. About how the traditions of a small island in the Mediterranean Sea intertwined with the fate of America in the 20th century. About how the concepts of honor and family became a cover for murders and drug trafficking. And about how the society that once protected its own turned into a monster, devouring its own children. We will go through 10 chapters, from the dusty Sicilian villages of the 19th century to the cybercrime of the 21st. We will see the birth of the legend, its heyday in the era of Prohibition, the war with Mussolini's fascism, the heroin frenzy of the 1970s, and the bloody battle with the Italian state. We will learn why the Mafia proved stronger than armies, how it penetrated the very heart of democracy, and why it still exists despite all efforts to destroy it. This is not just a criminal chronicle. This is a story about people, about those who chose the path of violence, and about those who gave their lives fighting it, about judges who knew they would be killed but continued their work, about traitors who violated the sacred omertà, the law of silence, about entire generations who grew up in the shadow of this organization. So pour yourself some tea, dim the lights, and let's begin. From the very beginning, from Sicily in the middle of the 19th century, when the word mafia did not yet mean anything terrifying, but was simply part of the local dialect. From the moment when history was just beginning, the roots of the Mafia, Sicily, after the unification of Italy, the middle of the 19th century. Sicily. Imagine an island that for centuries was a battlefield between great powers, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Normans, Spaniards. Each one came, took its share, and left, leaving behind ruins and hunger. And then, in the year 1860, Sicily finally became part of a unified Italy. It seemed like the beginning of a new era, but for simple Sicilians, nothing changed. Or rather, it only got worse. The new Italian state looked upon Sicily as a distant province that needed to be drained dry. Taxes grew, the land remained in the hands of large owners, latifundists, and peasants continued to toil on foreign fields for pennies. No justice, no laws that would protect the common person. Police? There were almost none. Courts? They worked only for the rich. If your goat was stolen or your family was offended, the state would not come to the rescue. You were on your own. And it was precisely in this void, in this vacuum of power, that what would later be called the Mafia began to sprout. You see, when the official government doesn't work, people always find an alternative. They create their own rules, their own system of protection, their own justice. In every village, people appeared whom you could turn to for help, not to the gendarmes, but to local authorities, those who knew everyone, controlled everything, and could solve your problem. For a fee, of course. These people called themselves onorata società, the honorable society. A beautiful name, right? It sounds noble, almost romantic. In reality, it was a system of mediation built on fear and respect. Do you have a conflict with a neighbor over land? Don't go to court. It will drag on for years. Turn to Don so-and-so. He will arrange everything. Quickly, efficiently, definitively. And everyone will be satisfied. Well, or pretend to be satisfied. And where did the word mafia come from anyway? It is still a mystery to historians. Some say it is an Arabic word meaning place of refuge. Others, that it is an acronym for a slogan from the time of the Sicilian Vespers in the year 1282, Morte alla Francia, Italia anela, death to France, Italy groans. But most likely, it is just a slang word from the Palermitan dialect, meaning something like tough, bold, self-confident. No mysticism, just a word that people used to describe a certain type of behavior. But by the end of the 19th century, this word began to take on a different nuance. The first newspaper articles appeared speaking of the Mafia as a secret organization terrorizing Sicily. The authorities began to use this term to explain why they could not restore order on the island. Allegedly, a powerful secret society was operating there. In reality, no single unified organization existed yet. There were separate groups, separate authorities in different cities and villages who sometimes cooperated, sometimes fought each other. Here is a typical story of those times. A large landowner fears that peasants will steal his harvest or set fire to his fields. The police are far away, and there is little point in them anyway. What to do? Hire security. But not simple guards, but local authorities, whom everyone fears and respects. These people were paid not a salary, but a share, a percentage of the harvest. And they guaranteed that no one would dare touch the master's property. And if someone did try, the consequences would be swift and brutal. Gradually, these people became a necessary element of the Sicilian economy. Not a single major deal, not a single contract was done without their participation. They were intermediaries between the rich and the poor, between the city and the village, between the government and the people, and they took their commission for everything. This was called pizzo, the tribute, a small tax for protection, for security, for the peace of your business. Imagine a shopkeeper in Palermo, opened a little shop trading fabrics, and then a man comes to him, polite, smiling, says, "You have a nice shop. It would be a shame if something happened. A fire, for example, or robbers. You know, it's dangerous to do business without protection nowadays." The shopkeeper understands the hint, starts paying a certain sum every month. And indeed, nothing happens to the shop, because now it is protected. And who would dare touch a shop protected by Don Carlo? This was a system that worked, effective, understood by everyone, time-tested. Yes, it was built on extortion and violence, but for many Sicilians it seemed fairer and more reliable than the distant Roman authority, which only sucked out money and gave nothing in return. The Mafia offered clear rules of the game. You pay, you are protected. You break the agreement, you are punished. Simple and clear. By the end of the 19th century, this system was so entrenched that it was impossible to conduct business in Sicily without mafioso intermediaries. They controlled the markets, transport, the citrus trade, the island's main wealth. Want to sell your lemon harvest? Turn to the Don. Need to negotiate supplies? Again, to the Don. Problems with a competitor? Guess who to go to? And here it is important to understand one thing. The first mafiosi were not bandits in our understanding. They did not rob people on the streets, did not burst into houses with pistols. On the contrary, they were often respected members of society. They owned land, attended church, baptized neighbors' children. Their power rested not on open terror, but on reputation, on rumors, on the fear of what might happen if you did not obey. They were masters of psychology. One hint, one meaningful glance was enough for a person to understand. Better not argue. The church at this time closed its eyes to what was happening. Moreover, many priests themselves were part of this system. They knew everything about everyone in their parish, and this information was invaluable to local authorities. And they, in turn, donated to churches, organized feasts of patron saints, helped poor families. Thus, a facade of piety and concern for the people was created. But behind this respectable facade lay cruelty, because alternative justice is always violence. If a man did not pay the tribute, his shop burned down. If someone informed the police, he was found dead on the road. If two people argued over land and one of them did not accept the mediator's decision, that dispute was settled with blood. It just wasn't talked about aloud. The code of silence was in effect, which would later be called omertà. Didn't see, didn't hear, know nothing. Even if your brother was killed right in front of your eyes, you keep silent, because if you speak, you and your whole family will be the next victims. By the beginning of the 20th century, Sicily was already an island living by two parallel laws: the official law of the Italian state and the unofficial law of the Mafia. And the second one worked much better than the first. This created a unique situation. The authorities knew about the existence of the Mafia, but could do nothing about it, because the whole island was silent. There were no witnesses. There was no evidence. There were only rumors, legends, stories that were passed on in whispers. It was in this atmosphere that the first generation of real mafiosi grew up. People who did not just solve local conflicts, but began to build broader networks of influence, who understood that crime could be a business, organized, profitable, long-term, and that for this, not just strength was needed, but structure, hierarchy, discipline. These people became the founders of what would later be called Cosa Nostra, our thing. So, we move to the turn of the centuries. The 19th century gives way to the 20th, and Sicily still remains an island where the real power belongs not to the state, but to shadowy figures who control people's lives through fear and respect. But now, something new is beginning. What was previously fragmented groups of local authorities is gradually turning into a real organization, with its own structure, its own rituals, its own philosophy. What the participants themselves called Cosa Nostra, our thing, is born. Why exactly, then? Because the world around was changing. The telegraph and railroads appeared, the economy became more complex, ties between cities grew stronger, and those who controlled these ties gained enormous power. The Mafia began to understand that they could earn money not only from local conflicts and collecting tribute from shopkeepers, they could control entire industries, from trade to construction. But this required coordination. Rules were needed. A system was needed that would allow different groups to work together without tearing each other's throats. And this is where the first legendary figures of the Sicilian Mafia appear. People whose names are still spoken with reverence on the island. The first of them is Don Vito Ferro. Now, there is a godfather in the classic sense. He was born in the small village of Bisacquino in the middle of the 19th century. He started as an ordinary mediator, settling small disputes, collecting tribute. But he had a talent. He could see further than others. He understood that the future lay in unification, in creating a network that would cover the entire island. Ferro was a man of the old school, the embodiment of that romantic image of the mafioso that cinema would later love so much. Always elegantly dressed, always polite, always speaking in riddles and hints. He never raised his voice, never threatened directly. His gaze, his meaningful pause in conversation, was enough for a person to understand everything without words. Ferro taught young mafiosi that true strength is not a pistol, but respect. That murder is a last resort, used only after all other methods have been exhausted. It was under Ferro that the initiation rituals that would later become the Mafia's calling card began to form. Imagine a dark room, several men sitting around a table. The novice who wants to become part of the family is led to the center. The rules are explained to him. The first rule is absolute loyalty. Family is everything. More important than your wife, more important than your children, more important than your own life. The second rule is omertà, the law of silence. No matter what happens, you will never betray your own. Not even under torture, not even in the face of death. Treachery is punished in only one way: death. The third rule is no dealings with the police. You do not cooperate with the authorities. You do not become a witness. You exist in a parallel world where state law has no force. After this, the novice is given a picture of a saint, usually the Madonna or the patron saint of Sicily. The picture is set on fire, and while it burns, the novice pronounces the oath. If I betray Cosa Nostra, may my flesh burn just as this image burns. Then his finger is pricked. A drop of blood is squeezed onto the ashes of the saint's image. The blood mixes with the ashes, a symbol that from now on his soul belongs to the family. And that's it. He has become part of this world forever, because there is no way out. The only way to leave the mafia is to die. These rituals might seem theatrical, even ridiculous, but they worked. They created a sense of belonging to something greater, to an ancient tradition, to a secret brotherhood. The person felt chosen, and this feeling was so strong that people truly went to their deaths, but did not break the oath. Omertà was maintained not only by the fear of punishment, but also by this mystical feeling of connection instilled through the ritual. Pharaoh also built relationships with those who were formerly on the other side of the barricades, with politicians, with the police, with the church. You see, the mafia was never a revolutionary force. It did not try to overthrow the state or change the system. On the contrary, it wanted to become part of that system, to parasitize on it. Therefore, mafiosi generously donated to the election campaigns of the necessary candidates. In return, they received protection, information about impending arrests, and freedom of action. Relations with the church were even closer. Many priests themselves were children of mafia families. They grew up in that environment and considered it natural. Mafiosi were parishioners, godfathers, organizers of religious holidays. They kissed the bishop's hand, and an hour later could order a man killed. And they saw no contradiction in this, because in their worldview, God was somewhere up there in heaven, dealing with eternal things. But here, on earth, different laws applied. The laws of blood, honor, and strength. It was during this time that the famous Mafia Code of Honor was formed, rules that every self-respecting mafioso had to obey. Do not touch the wives and children of other men. Do not steal from your own. Do not betray. Keep your word. Be fair in your decisions. Protect the weak from the arbitrary rule of the strong. Sounds noble, right? Almost like a knightly code. And indeed, many mafiosi sincerely believed that they were not bandits, but protectors of the people, guardians of tradition, the last true men in a world where everything had become corrupt and false. But the reality, of course, was different, because this code worked only within the family. Towards their own, yes, there were rules. Towards outsiders, no rules. To kill a person who does not pay tribute, to burn down the house of someone who dared to disobey, to rape the daughter of an informer, all this was considered normal, because they were outsiders. They did not deserve the respect and protection of the code, and murders became more frequent during that time. The concept of honor killing, omertà killing, appeared. It was not just a crime, it was a ritual, a message. When a person was killed in a mafia style, the body was always found in a conspicuous place. usually with specific signs, for example, with a coin in the mouth, which meant he talked too much, or with severed hands, which meant he stole from the family. This was a system of communication. People saw the body and immediately understood why the person had paid the price, and they drew conclusions. Pharaoh also understood the importance of territorial division. Sicily was divided into zones of influence. Palermo was controlled by one clan, Corleone by another, Trapani by a third. And there was an agreement between them. Do not encroach on foreign territory. Do not poach others' people. Do not touch others' business. If a conflict arises, we sit down at the negotiating table, we figure it out. This system worked surprisingly effectively. Of course, there were wars between clans, but they were rare, because war is bad for business. It attracts police attention, frightens people, interferes with work. Palermo becomes the capital of the mafia world, a city on the seashore, surrounded by mountains, with narrow medieval streets where it is easy to hide from pursuers. Here, the mafia controlled everything: the port, the markets, construction, transport. This is where the bosses' meetings took place, where people's fates were decided. And here, a special culture was formed, a mixture of aristocracy and banditry. Mafiosi wore expensive suits, spoke refined Italian, quoted poets, and at the same time could coolly order a man's eyes gouged out for disrespect. In Corleone, a small town in the mountains, the traditions were harsher. Here, the most ruthless mafiosi grew up, those for whom violence was not a last resort, but a common tool of work. The Corleone clans kept to themselves, were more closed, more paranoid, and even then, other families were afraid of the Corleone people, sensing that something was wrong with them. But this would only be learned many decades later, when the Corleone clans would stage a real massacre. Pharaoh was also the first to understand that the mafia could go beyond Sicily, that in the wider world there were huge opportunities for earning. And at the end of the 19th century, he made several trips to America, met with Sicilian emigrants there, established connections, taught them how to organize business the American way. These contacts would bear fruit a few years later, when the American Mafia would become more powerful and richer than its Sicilian progenitor. But for now, Pharaoh reigned in Sicily. He was untouchable. The police knew about him, knew that he was behind dozens of murders, hundreds of crimes. But there was no proof. There were no witnesses. There were only rumors and legends. They said that Pharaoh could kill a man just by looking at him, that he had people in all the key points of the island, that he knew about every crime committed in Sicily, even if he did not give the order himself. And here it is important to understand the contrast between image and reality, because even then the romantic myth of the mafioso began to form. In folk songs, in street stories, they were portrayed as noble bandits, as protectors of the poor against the arbitrary rule of the rich. The mafioso is one who does not bow his head before authority, who lives by his own rules, who will protect your honor when the law is powerless. A beautiful picture. And the reality? The reality is terrified peasants who give their last money for tribute. It is merchants who cannot work without the permission of the local don. It is women who are afraid to go out after their husband was killed for debts. It is children who grow up in an atmosphere of violence and silence, and for whom this world becomes the only possible one. It is entire neighborhoods where people live by the laws of the Middle Ages, not the 20th century. By the beginning of the 910ths of years, Cosa Nostra was finally established as an organization, with its own hierarchy, boss, deputy, counselors, soldiers, with its own rules for resolving conflicts, with its own economy, which parasitized on all the legal businesses of the island, and with absolute confidence in its impunity, because the government was weak, society was intimidated, and the system worked like clockwork. But clouds were already gathering on the horizon, because the world did not stand still. Big changes were starting in Italy, and for the Mafia, as we shall soon see, big changes always meant either new opportunities or mortal danger, or both at the same time. Emigration and the Mafia in America. And now let's move across the ocean, because while Cosa Nostra was forming in Sicily, on the other side of the world, a story unfolded that would forever change the fate of the Mafia and transform it from a local Sicilian phenomenon into a global force. We are talking about the great wave of Italian emigration to America. Imagine the end of the 19th century. Sicily is suffocating from poverty. Little land, no work, no prospects. And suddenly, rumors arrive of a distant country across the ocean where anyone can get rich, where there is plenty of land, where you don't have to bow to the dons and pay endless tributes. America, the promised land, the last hope for those who have nothing to lose. And the exodus begins. Mass, unprecedented in scale. From 1890 to 1920th year, more than 4 million people emigrated from Italy to America. 4 million! Entire villages were emptying. Men left first, promising to send for their families when they settled down. Many never returned. They boarded ships in Palermo, in Naples, spent weeks in cramped holds, got sick, died of infections. And those who survived to New York saw the Statue of Liberty and believed that their lives would finally change. But the reality turned out to be harsher than the dream, because America did not greet the Italians with open arms. They were considered dirty, uneducated, dangerous. They were given the hardest and lowest paid work, digging canals, building roads, unloading ships. They settled in the slums of large cities, in overcrowded apartment buildings without plumbing or heating. Their children worked in factories for 14 hours a day. Their wives were insulted on the streets. And very quickly, Italians realized that in America they were just as much outcasts as they had been in Sicily. Only now, they were also strangers. And this is where the most interesting part begins. Because along with honest peasants and workers, other people also came to America. The very ones who already knew how the world worked in Sicily, who understood that the law was one thing and real power was something else entirely, who knew how to organize, intimidate, control. Mafiosi, they did not advertise who they were. They arrived as ordinary emigrants, disappearing into the crowd. But very quickly they began to do what they did best, creating a parallel authority where the official government did not work. The first Italian quarters in American cities were the ideal environment for the Mafia. People didn't speak English, didn't trust the police, lived in closed communities. They needed someone of their own to help solve problems, protect them from local bandits, and help them find work. And people appeared who were ready to help, for a fee. The system, perfected in Sicily, began to work in the New World as well. One of the first American cities where the Mafia truly took root was New Orleans, a city in the South, a port city with a large Italian community. And here, in the year 1890, an event occurred that first attracted the attention of all America to the Italian Mafia: the murder of Police Chief David Hennessy. Hennessy was an Irishman, a tough cop of the old school. He knew that something was wrong in the Italian quarter. He knew about the extortions, about the murders, about the organized group among the emigrants that was terrorizing their own countrymen. He started an investigation, collected witnesses, prepared arrests. And one evening, returning home, he was shot in the street from an ambush. Before he died, Bleeding, he managed to gasp, "Dagos," a derogatory nickname for Italians. That was enough. Mass arrests began. The police grabbed Italians by the hundreds, regardless of whether they were guilty or not. Several people accused of organizing the murder were also imprisoned. The trial began, but witnesses, one after another, refused to testify. Those who promised to talk disappeared or changed their minds. Omertà worked even in America. In the end, the jury acquitted the defendants. And then the terrible thing happened. An enraged mob, several thousand people, stormed the prison where the acquitted Italians were being held. They were dragged out into the street and lynched. 11 people were hanged or shot right in the middle of the city in broad daylight. Vigilante justice. The police did not intervene. The authorities turned a blind eye, and the newspapers wrote that justice had prevailed, that the American people had shown the Mafia who was boss here. But in reality, this event had the opposite effect. The Italian community withdrew further into itself. Trust in the authorities finally vanished. And the Mafia strengthened, because now it had an additional argument. Look, Americans hate us. We need to stick together, protect each other. Who will protect us if not our own? Gradually, Mafia structures appeared in all major cities with Italian populations. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, Detroit. Each city became a new territory, a new opportunity. And here it is important to understand that the American Mafia immediately began to differ from the Sicilian one. It was more aggressive, more open to violence, less bound by tradition. In New York, the key figure became Giuseppe Morello, who was nicknamed the Clutch Hand because of a deformed hand. Morello came from Corleone, the very town where the most ruthless mafiosi were raised. He quickly realized that in America you could earn money from things they didn't even dream of in Sicily. New types of business appeared: counterfeiting money, arms trafficking, control over unions, industrial-scale extortion. Morello created the first real mafia family in New York, with its own territory, the Little Italy neighborhood in Manhattan, with its own people, soldiers who carried out orders without question, with its own sources of income. He controlled the markets where Italians traded, took a percentage of every deal, forced shop owners to pay for protection, and killed those who did not obey. His method of murder became legendary. The victim was found with severed genitals stuffed into his mouth. This was a message. You are not a man, you are a traitor. You do not deserve even to be buried like a human being. Morello did not just kill. He humiliated, intimidated, showed everyone else what would happen if they disobeyed. The situation was similar in Chicago. A large Italian community, weak police, corrupt officials, ideal conditions. Here, the Mafia began to control working-class neighborhoods, docks, meatpacking plants. The first union bosses appeared who were connected to the Mafia. Want to get a job at the factory? Pay. Want your cargo unloaded without problems? Pay. Want to open a business? Guess what? Pay. But most importantly, the Mafia learned to work with politicians. In America, politicians were elected, which meant they needed voters' voices. And the Mafia could provide those votes. In Italian neighborhoods, the bosses controlled who voted for whom. They organized rallies, brought people to the polling stations, ensured that everyone voted correctly. And in exchange, they received protection, contracts, the right to do whatever they wanted without police interference. By the beginning of the 20th century, there were already several dozen mafia groups in America. They competed with each other, sometimes fought, sometimes negotiated. But for now, this was minor compared to what was about to happen. Because the Mafia still remained a local phenomenon, limited to Italian neighborhoods, It was rich, but not that rich. Influential, but not that influential. And here it is necessary to understand an important thing about the nature of organized crime. It does not exist in a vacuum. It parasitizes on society, on its weaknesses, on its demands. If society wants something that is forbidden by law, crime will provide it, and it will make huge money doing it. This is exactly what happened when America decided to conduct one of the most insane social experiments in its history. But this is the next chapter of our story. The chapter about how the state, with its own hands, created the conditions for the Mafia to transform from a group of street bandits into a powerful empire. The chapter about Prohibition, a time when crime became the most profitable business in the country. When simple immigrants turned into millionaires in a few years, when the streets of American cities turned into battlefields. Meanwhile, in the early 910ths of years, the Mafia was just finding its way in the New World. Learning the English language, studying American laws and finding loopholes in them, establishing connections with local politicians and police officers, mastering new types of business, and preparing for its shining hour, which would arrive very soon. Prohibition and the rise of the American Mafia. So, we have come to the moment that forever changed the history of the American Mafia and transformed it from a local ethnic group into a national corporation of crime. The 16th of January, 1920th year. At midnight across America, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution came into effect. From now on, the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol were prohibited throughout the United States. Prohibition. An experiment that was supposed to clean up the nation, eradicate drunkenness, make America cleaner and more moral. In practice, the exact opposite happened. Because you can forbid anything, but if people want it, they will find a way to get it. And wherever there is demand for the forbidden, there always appears someone who will satisfy that demand for good money. And the Mafia found itself in the right place at the right time. Imagine the scale of what was happening. An entire country, 100 million people, was suddenly deprived of access to something that was part of their daily life. Beer after work, whiskey at the bar, a glass of wine at dinner. All this suddenly became illegal. But people did not stop wanting to drink. On the contrary, forbidden fruit is always sweeter, and a huge black market emerged where billions could be earned. The Mafia instantly realized what a gift the state had given them. Before this, they lived off petty extortion, gambling, prostitution. Decent money, but still localized. And here, an entire industry that needed to be created from scratch. Alcohol suppliers, warehouses, transport, security, distribution points, connections with politicians and police for cover were needed. A real corporation was needed, and the Mafia began to build it. The first to enter the game were those who already had international connections. Smuggling came from all sides. Whiskey was brought from Canada across the Great Lakes. Tequila and rum from Mexico across the border. Rum from Cuba and the Bahamas on fast boats from the Caribbean islands. Entire flotillas of ships cruised along the coast, unloading crates of bottles onto deserted beaches at night. It was a game of cat and mouse with the Coast Guard, but the profit was so huge that the risk paid off 100-fold. Underground distilleries began to appear inside the country. In the basements of houses, in garages, in abandoned factories, people brewed moonshine, often of disgusting quality, sometimes simply poisonous. But it was bought because it was the only available alcohol. And the Mafia controlled these clandestine enterprises, collected tribute from them, or simply seized them by force. Speakeasies, underground bars, appeared. The name came from the phrase, "speak easy," because conspiracy had to be maintained. Officially, these were ordinary establishments, barbershops, laundries, bookstores. But if you knew the password and they knew your face, you were led through the back door into a room where music played, where elegantly dressed people sat with glasses in their hands. By the end of the 1920s, there were more than 30,000 such establishments in New York alone. 30,000! More than the legal bars before the Prohibition. And behind every speakeasy stood the Mafia. They owned them or controlled the supply of alcohol to them. They provided protection from police raids, through bribes to the right people. They resolved conflicts between the owners of the establishments. They set prices. Speakeasies became gold mines that brought in incredible money daily. And this is where the names that would go down in history begin to appear. The first and most famous is Al Capone. Alphonse Capone, son of Italian immigrants from Naples, born in Brooklyn. He started as a petty street bandit, worked as a bouncer in bars, participated in shootouts. Nothing special. But he had a talent. He understood that violence was a tool, not an end. That real money was made not on the street, but in offices. That you needed to think like a businessman, not like a bandit. In the early 1920s, Capone moved to Chicago, where he was taken under the wing of the local mafia boss. And when that man was killed, Capone took his place and began to build an empire. In a few years, he turned the Chicago Mafia into a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He controlled the supply of alcohol throughout the Midwest. He had connections in the city administration, in the police, in the courts. Half of Chicago's officials were on his payroll. Capone was a genius of PR. He didn't hide like the old mafiosi. On the contrary, he was a media figure, gave interviews to journalists, distributed food to the poor during the Great Depression, appeared at baseball games where he was greeted with ovations. He created the image of a folk hero, a Robin Hood, who gave people what they wanted, despite the stupid laws. And many Americans truly saw him as a hero. But behind this public image was a ruthless machine of violence. Because Chicago became a battlefield between various mafia groups for control over the lucrative business. Every gang wanted a piece of the pie, and the only way to settle a dispute was to destroy the competitors. Wars began. Real ones, with machine guns, grenades, armored cars. The most famous episode was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on the 14th of February, 1929th year. 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a wall in a garage and machine-gunned by Capone's men, disguised in police uniforms. The bodies were riddled with hundreds of bullets. It was a demonstration of force, a message to everyone else. Do not mess with Al Capone. But Chicago was not the only place where the drama unfolded. The same thing was happening in New York, only on a larger scale. Because New York was the largest city in the country, and controlling it meant incredible wealth. Several major mafia families were operating here, each with its own territory, its own connections, its own ambitions. The key figures were Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, both Sicilians of the old school, raised in the traditions of Cosa Nostra. Masseria, nicknamed Joe the Boss, controlled Lower Manhattan. Fat, crude, greedy. He believed in strength, and only strength. Maranzano was his opposite, refined, educated, knew Latin, admired Julius Caesar and his military strategies. He wanted to build the mafia on the model of the Roman Empire with a clear hierarchy and discipline. The conflict between them was inevitable. Both wanted to be boss of all bosses, the sole ruler of the New York Mafia. And in 1930th year, the war began that would later be called the Castellamarese War, named after the Sicilian town from which many participants on both sides originated. This was the first real mafia civil war in America. Murders occurred daily. People were shot in the streets. Their cars were blown up. They were found tied up and shot in car trunks. More than 60 people died in a year. New York turned into a war zone. The police were powerless. The mafiosi killed each other and disappeared, leaving no trace. And here enters the man who would change everything. Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Young, ambitious, completely unlike the old mafiosi. Luciano was born in Sicily, but came to America as a child. He grew up on the streets of New York, spoke English better than Italian. For him, the traditions of the old world meant nothing. He was a pragmatist, a businessman, who understood that wars were bad for business. Luciano worked for Masseria, but saw that his boss was stupid and short-sighted, saw that the war was destroying everything they had built, and he made a decision that was considered unthinkable under the old rules. He betrayed his boss, organized his murder. On the 15th of April, 1931st year, Masseria was shot dead in a restaurant on Coney Island, after a hearty lunch while playing cards. 4 bullets to the head and back. Luciano was with him in the restaurant, but at the moment of the murder was allegedly in the restroom. A classic alibi. It seemed like Maranzano had won. He declared himself boss of all bosses and tried to establish a new order. He divided New York among 5 families, each with its own territory. This division, incidentally, has survived to this day. The 5 families of New York became a legend. But Maranzano made a fatal mistake. He did not trust Luciano, considered him too ambitious, too dangerous, and decided to eliminate him. But Luciano found out about the plans earlier, and on the 10th of September, 1931st year, just 5 months after Masseria's murder, Luciano's men, disguised as IRS agents, burst into Maranzano's office and shot him. Along with him, several dozen other old mafiosi, Maranzano's supporters, were killed across the country on the same day. It was a purge, a night of the long knives, American style. And now, power was in the hands of a new generation. Luciano did not declare himself boss of all bosses. He understood that this position attracted too much attention and envy. Instead, he created something completely new, the Commission, a council of the heads of the largest mafia families which would solve all important issues by voting. No sole ruler. Collective leadership, like in a corporation. This was a brilliant move. The Commission gave every boss a vote, reduced conflicts, and allowed actions to be coordinated. Rules were established. You cannot kill without the Commission's permission. You cannot attack another family's territory. All major operations must be agreed upon. If you break the rules, everyone else will unite against you. Luciano also began collaborating with the Jewish and Irish mafias. For the old Sicilians, this was unthinkable, working with non-Italians. But Luciano was not constrained by prejudice. He understood that money has no nationality. His best partners were the Jewish gangsters Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. Together, they created a true multi-ethnic criminal corporation. By the mid-1930s, the Mafia completely controlled the illegal alcohol industry in America. But then, the unexpected happened. In 1933rd year, Prohibition was repealed. The experiment failed. The state admitted that the ban did not work, but only generated crime. Alcohol became legal again. Many thought this was the end of the Mafia, that without its main source of income, it would collapse. But the opposite happened. Because during the 13 years of Prohibition, the Mafia accumulated huge capital, created networks of influence, and learned to operate as a large business. They simply switched to other types of activities: gambling, drugs, unions, construction. The legalization of alcohol did not stop them, but only forced them to become more inventive. Furthermore, the mafia learned how to launder money and penetrate legitimate businesses. They bought restaurants, hotels, nightclubs, laundries, construction companies. On paper, everything looked legal. In practice, millions of dirty dollars passed through these enterprises, and the owners were respected businessmen who went to church on Sundays and donated to charity. Prohibition transformed the mafia from an ethnic group into an American institution. It gave them the capital, experience, and connections that allowed them to build an empire. And it showed one simple truth. When the state prohibits what the people want, organized crime wins. Always. But new challenges awaited the mafia. Because while it flourished in America, events were taking place in its homeland, in Sicily, that would threaten its very existence. In Italy, a man came to power who would declare total war on the mafia, and this would be a war of life and death. Italy, under Mussolini, mafia versus fascism. And now, let's return to Italy. Because while the mafia in America was turning into a powerful empire and swimming in money from alcohol smuggling, events were happening in its homeland, in Sicily, that almost completely destroyed it. The story of how two totalitarian systems collided, the mafia and fascism. And what happens when a dictator decides that only one absolute power can exist on his territory. The 28th of October, 1922nd year. Benito Mussolini came to power in Italy. The March on Rome, the black shirts, the fascist salute. You probably know all this. Mussolini promised to make Italy great again, restore order, and put an end to chaos and crime. And for him, the mafia was a symbol of everything he hated: lawlessness, parallel authority, the humiliation of the state. You see, fascism by its nature does not tolerate competitors. The duce must be the sole master. Any organization that does not directly obey the state is a threat. And the mafia in Sicily was exactly that. A state within a state that collected its own taxes, dispensed its own justice, established its own laws. And Mussolini decided to put an end to it once and for all. There is a legend about what prompted him to make this decision. In 1924th year, Mussolini visited Sicily. In the small town of Piana dei Greci, he was met by the local mafia boss, Don Ciccio Cuccia. And this Don allowed himself to tell Mussolini that he didn't need to arrange security. He, Don Ciccio, guaranteed the Duce's safety on his territory. In other words, he made it clear that he was the boss here, not some Roman dictator. Mussolini flew into a rage. Upon returning to Rome, he delivered his famous speech. "If the mafia exists, it will be destroyed. I swear before God and before the entire Italian nation." And he truly began a war, a total, ruthless war against the Sicilian Mafia. A special person was appointed to conduct this campaign, Prefect Cesare Mori, who was nicknamed the Iron Prefect. Mori was an old-school policeman, incorruptible, tough, fanatically devoted to the idea of law and order. He was given emergency powers, the right to arrest anyone without a warrant, conduct searches any time, and use any methods to obtain confessions. In fact, he was given carte blanche for what would be impossible in a normal rule of law state. And Mori began to act. His methods were simple and ruthless. He arrested everyone indiscriminately, not only known mafiosi, but also their relatives, friends, everyone who had ever dealt with them. Entire villages were surrounded by the military and police. People were held for weeks in overcrowded prisons without charges. They were interrogated, tortured, and forced to testify against each other. Mori understood that the main strength of the mafia lay in silence, in omertà, and he methodically broke this code. He showed people that silence would not protect them, that they and their families would suffer. He offered deals, testify, and we will release your relatives. If you don't, they rot in prison with you. Many broke. For the first time in the mafia's entire history, people began to speak. Arrests came in waves. Thousands of people were arrested in a few years. Large trials where hundreds of defendants sat in the dock simultaneously. Sentences were handed down quickly, often without proper evidence. Mafiosi received decades of prison or were exiled to remote islands. Their property was confiscated. Their families ended up on the street. But Mori went further. He did not just arrest criminals. He destroyed the very system on which the mafia rested. He liquidated the mediation system. Now all disputes had to be resolved only through official courts. He dispersed meetings where mafiosi gathered to discuss business. He cut off financial flows, closed enterprises through which money was laundered. He imprisoned corrupt officials and police officers who worked for the mafia. The results were impressive. By the end of the 1920s, the mafia in Sicily was practically routed. Those who were not arrested fled, many to America, where their brothers in crime were prospering. The island, which had lived under the laws of omertà for decades, suddenly became quiet and peaceful. Murders stopped. The collection of tribute stopped. The system collapsed. Mussolini triumphed. He announced that the mafia was defeated, that Sicily was finally free from this plague. And indeed, everything looked great on paper. Crime statistics fell. Newspapers praised the regime's successes. Mori became a national hero. But there was one problem. The mafia was not destroyed. It was driven underground. Many mafiosi were indeed in prisons or had fled abroad, but those who remained free simply lay low. They stopped drawing attention to themselves, stopped engaging in open criminal activity. They waited, because they knew what Mussolini did not, that the mafia is not just an organization, it is a way of life, a value system that is passed down through generations. It can be suppressed, but it cannot be completely destroyed. And their patience was rewarded, because the fascist regime, which seemed unbreakable, collapsed 15 years later. World War II began. Italy fought on Hitler's side. And when it became clear that Germany was losing, the Allies decided to strike at the soft underbelly of fascism, to land in Sicily. The 10th of July, 1943rd year. Operation Husky began, the largest amphibious operation in history at that time. American and British troops landed on the southern coast of Sicily. And here begins one of the most mysterious and contradictory pages in the history of the mafia. There is a legend, and it is still unclear how true it is, that American intelligence contacted the Sicilian Mafia in advance and asked for help. The logic was simple. The Mafia hates Mussolini for what he did to them. Therefore, they would be happy to help the Allies overthrow the fascist regime, and in return, amnesty, return to power, restoration of old positions. And indeed, the landing went surprisingly smoothly. Italian troops offered almost no resistance. Entire garrisons surrendered without a fight. The local population greeted the Americans as liberators. Guides appeared from somewhere, showing safe roads, warning about ambushes, telling them where the German positions were, as if someone had organized everything in advance. Moreover, the American military administration began appointing local residents to key posts. And very often these people turned out to be former mafiosi, the very ones Mussolini had imprisoned or exiled. They were released, given power, made mayors of cities, police chiefs. Officially, because they were anti-fascists, suffered under the regime, knew the local situation, unofficially, because there was an agreement. The central figure in this story is Lucky Luciano, the very man who created the commission and modernized the American Mafia. By that time, he was in prison. He was jailed in 1936th year for organizing a prostitution ring, the only thing prosecutors could pin on him, because everything else was covered too well. He received a sentence of 30 to 50 years. It seemed his career was over. But when the war began, American Special Services had a problem. Sabotage began on the docks of New York. Ships burned, warehouses exploded. Someone was sabotaging military supplies, and the authorities realized that the Mafia controlled the docks, which meant only they could stop the sabotage. And they turned to Luciano. The deal was simple. Luciano gives an order from prison, and the sabotage stops. Order on the docks is restored, and in return, he is promised a sentence review after the war. Luciano agreed, and indeed, the sabotage stopped as if by magic. And then, when preparations for the landing in Sicily began, they came to Luciano again. Contacts, information, people on the island they could trust were needed, and Luciano gave them names, addresses, passwords. His connections with the Sicilian Mafia, despite years of separation, remained strong, and these connections helped the Allies. How much of this is true? It's hard to say. Documents are classified or destroyed. Participants have long been dead. Only rumors, legends, circumstantial evidence remain. But the fact remains, after the liberation of Sicily, the Mafia returned to power. Those whom Mussolini considered destroyed once again became the masters of the island. The American military administration turned a blind eye to their activities, and many intelligence officers who worked in Sicily later built careers in the CIA and maintained ties with the Mafia for decades. Luciano received his part of the deal. In 1946th year, immediately after the end of the war, he was released from prison. True, with a condition: immediate deportation to Italy. America no longer wanted to see him. He went to Naples, then moved to Cuba, trying to run operations from there. But his former influence was gone. He died in 1962nd year at the Naples airport from a heart attack. He was waiting for journalists to whom he wanted to give an interview about his life. He didn't make it, and a new era began in Sicily. The Mafia that returned from oblivion was different. It had learned the lessons of the war with fascism. It understood that one should not be too noticeable. One should not openly challenge the state. One needed to act more subtly through political connections, through legal business, through corruption. And this is exactly what it would become in the post-war years. Less bloody, but more powerful. Integrated into the very fabric of Italian society so deeply that separating it would become impossible. Post-war Italy and political symbiosis. So the war ended. Italy lay in ruins, bombed cities, a destroyed economy, hunger, chaos. Fascism had fallen, the king had abdicated. The country was balancing on the brink of civil war between communists and everyone else. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear, a new Italy needed to be built, and the Mafia turned out to be one of those who would build it. Only, of course, it was building not for the people, but for itself. After the American liberation of Sicily, mafiosi returned from prisons, from exile, from the underground. They were older, wiser, more cautious. The defeat by Mussolini taught them an important lesson. You cannot openly challenge the state. You cannot be too visible. You must act from within the system, not against it. You must not fight authority, but become part of that authority. And this is exactly what they began to do. The first order of business was to restore the structures. Much had been destroyed during 20 years of persecution. Old bosses had died or grown decrepit. The younger generation had grown up without proper education in mafia traditions. Connections were broken, territories mixed up. Reorganization was needed. And it began. In Sicily, secret meetings of bosses, the very cupolas where key issues were decided, began to gather again. Who controls which territory? How to divide new opportunities for earning? How to interact with the authorities? Old initiation rituals were restored. The system of families was revived, where each had its own head, its own captains, its own soldiers. The mafia was regaining its form. But the content had changed, because the world around was different. Post-war Sicily is not the patriarchal island of the 19th century. It is part of a modern state where political parties, trade unions, and democratic institutions operate. And the mafia realized that it needed to adapt to the new reality. It needed to learn how to work with the political system. And here, a key player of post-war Italy enters the stage: the Christian Democratic Party. This was a center party, Catholic in spirit, anti-communist in essence. It dominated Italian politics for almost half a century, and very quickly a symbiosis was established between the mafia and the Christian Democrats, a relationship of mutual benefit where each side got what it wanted. The Christian Democrats needed voters' voices, and in Sicily, traditionally, voters voted not based on conviction, but on the instructions of local authorities. The mafia controlled entire neighborhoods. If the boss said, "Vote for Party X," everyone voted for Party X. This was called vote exchange, and it was extremely effective. In return, the mafia received protection. Politicians turned a blind eye to their activities. The police received instructions not to poke their noses into certain matters. Prosecutors did not initiate inconvenient cases. And most importantly, the mafia gained access to state contracts, to land distribution, to post-war reconstruction programs. And here opened up fantastic opportunities for enrichment. After the war, the government launched a program of agrarian reform. Large estates were divided into small plots and distributed to peasants. A noble idea, right? To give land to those who work it. But in practice, the distribution of land was controlled by local commissions in which people connected to the mafia sat. And the land went not to the poorest peasants, but to those who paid bribes, who had the necessary connections. And then these plots were bought cheaply by mafia people. The old system of land ownership was restored, just under new signboards. But the real money was not in the land. The real money was in construction. Post-war reconstruction, the economic boom of the 1950s and 1960s, mass urbanization, all this required building, building, building. Roads, buildings, ports, factories. The state allocated huge funds for this, and the mafia wanted a piece of this pie. Palermo became a symbol of what would later be called the sack of Palermo. The beautiful old city on the seashore began to be disfigured by ugly concrete boxes. They built without permits, without plans, without complying with standards. Historical buildings were demolished to erect high-rise buildings in their place. The city was built up chaotically, greedily, barbarically. Behind every construction site stood the mafia. They controlled the supply of cement, hence the term cement mafia. They controlled construction companies. They received state contracts through their people in the administration. They inflated estimates several times over. They used substandard materials. Buildings were built hastily. Many later collapsed, burying people under them. But the money was made. Huge, dirty, bloody money. One of the most famous mafia bosses of that time was Luciano, nicknamed Legione. He came from a poor peasant family, illiterate, cruel as a beast. He started as an ordinary bandit, stole cattle, robbed, but then he realized where the real money was. He moved to Palermo, got involved in the construction business, and in a few years he became one of the richest men in Sicily. Leggio was the embodiment of the new type of mafioso. For him, there were no rules, no code of honor. He killed everyone who stood in his way, competitors, witnesses, even members of his own family if he suspected them of betrayal. He was the first to use explosives, not revolvers and knives, as in the old days, but dynamite. He blew up cars with people in broad daylight. It was spectacular. It sowed terror. It showed that the mafia was no longer afraid to attract attention. But at the same time, Leggio was part of the system. He had connections in the highest offices. He met with ministers, with members of parliament. He was invited to official receptions because he controlled voters' voices, because he gave bribes, because the politicians needed him just as much as he needed them. This was the time that historians would later call the golden age of the Sicilian Mafia, the 1950s and 1960s, a time when the mafia was stronger than ever, yet relatively invisible to the general public. Murders happened, but not so frequently. There was violence, but it was controlled. The mafia learned to work quietly, through corruption and connections, rather than through open terror. In Rome, they preferred not to talk about it. Officially, the mafia did not exist. They were just separate criminal groups, nothing serious. Journalists who tried to write about politicians' connections with the mafia received lawsuits for libel. Prosecutors who tried to investigate were transferred to other cities. The system protected itself. And in Sicily, life went on as usual. People were accustomed to the mafia being a part of reality. It was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It controlled the markets where you bought food, the construction companies that built your house, the transportation companies that moved goods. It was an invisible network that enveloped the entire island, and resisting it was useless and dangerous. But tension was building beneath this calm surface, because the old system was beginning to crack. The old bosses, raised in the traditions of Cosa Nostra, were gradually leaving the stage. A new generation was replacing them, and this generation was different. The young mafiosi did not remember the times of Don Vito Cascioferro. They had not heard lectures on honor and dignity. They grew up in the post-war chaos, in an atmosphere of profiteering and cynicism. For them, the mafia was not a sacred tradition, but a way to get rich quickly. They did not respect the old rules. They were ready to kill women and children if it brought profit. They were greedier, tougher, more unscrupulous than their fathers. And gradually, conflicts began to escalate within the mafia. The old guard tried to maintain control, adhere to traditions. The young ones strove for power, wanted more money, more influence, were unwilling to wait their turn. Disputes arose over territories, over shares in business, over who was in charge. Disputes that used to be resolved at the negotiating table were now increasingly resolved with blood. By the end of the 1960s, it became clear that the period of silence was ending, that a new wave of violence was ahead. Because when the balance in the mafia is disturbed, when consensus breaks down, when greed prevails over common sense, war begins. And this war would be more terrible than anything Sicily had seen before. But there were also external factors that would change everything, because a new business appeared on the horizon, a business so profitable that all previous sources of income would seem like child's play, a business that would bring the mafia untold riches, but also stain its reputation forever. A business that would transform the mafia from a local Sicilian problem into a global threat. We are talking about drugs, about heroin, which would flood from Sicily into America and Europe, about billions of dirty dollars, about thousands of ruined lives, and about a war that would tear the Mafia apart from within and turn Palermo into a slaughterhouse. But that would be in the 1970s. For now, at the end of the 1960s, the last old-timers were still trying to maintain the illusion that everything was under control, that the Mafia remained what it always was, an organization of honor and tradition. They did not know, or did not want to know, that their time was over, that a generation of monsters was coming to replace them, and very soon the whole world would know about it. Drugs and the Second Mafia War. And now we come to the bloodiest period in the history of the Sicilian Mafia. To the times when the streets of Palermo turned into a slaughterhouse, when several people were killed a day, when explosions thundered like fireworks, when the Mafia finally dropped the mask of noble protectors of the people and showed its true face, the face of a ruthless criminal machine ready to destroy anyone for money and power. It all started with drugs, more precisely, with heroin. In the late 1960s, a real drug boom began in America and Europe. Youth counterculture, hippies, rock music, all this was accompanied by mass drug use. The demand for heroin skyrocketed. And where there is huge demand for a forbidden substance, there will always be those who satisfy that demand. The Sicilian Mafia saw the opportunity. Before this, they were involved in drugs sporadically, on a small scale. But now, it became clear that billions could be earned here, sums that were previously unimaginable. One successful batch of heroin brought in more than a year of working with cement, land, and construction combined. The scheme was perfected. Opium base was brought from Turkey or Afghanistan. In Sicily, in secret laboratories hidden in the countryside, it was turned into pure heroin. Then it was transported to America through various channels, in containers with legal cargo, on fishing boats, in the luggage of unsuspecting tourists. There it was sold through a network of dealers. The profit was astronomical. Invest $1, get 100, or even more. Sicily became the global center for heroin production. The very French connection that the famous movie was about passed through Sicily. Local chemists learned to make heroin of a purity that no one else did. They were masters of their craft. And the Mafia controlled the entire process, from purchasing raw materials to selling the final product. Money flowed like a river. Unimaginable money. Mafiosi built themselves luxurious villas, bought factories and hotels, opened accounts in Swiss banks. They swam in wealth, and this wealth corrupted them completely. Because when it comes to such money, all rules collapse. Greed overshadows reason, and war begins for control over this golden stream. In the 1970s, two groups clearly stood out within the Sicilian Mafia. On one side, the old guard, the bosses from Palermo, who still tried to adhere to traditions, resolve conflicts through negotiation, maintain balance. On the other side, the so-called Corleone clans, from the town of Corleone and surrounding villages. And these Corleone people were of a completely different breed. Corleone, a small town in the mountains of central Sicily, a harsh, poor, isolated place. The cruelest mafiosi were always raised here. Here, human life was worth nothing. Here, the concepts of honor and tradition were merely a cover for a primal thirst for power. And in the 1970s, a generation emerged from Corleone that would change everything. The key figure is Salvatore Totò Riina. Stocky, short, with the face of a peasant, nickname, the Beast. And it was an accurate nickname. Riina was the embodiment of pure evil. He killed for the first time at 19 years old, then the second, the third, the 10th. He lost count. For him, murder was a natural act, like brushing his teeth. No emotions, no pangs of conscience. Need to eliminate a person, so we eliminate them. Alongside Riina were his comrades, Bernardo Provenzano, Leoluca Bagarella, and other Corleone members. They were all raised in an atmosphere of total violence. All despised the Palermo bosses, considering them weak and effeminate, and all wanted to seize power over the mafia, and, consequently, over the drug traffic. In the late 1970s, the Second Mafia War began, as historians would later call it. In reality, it was a massacre. The systematic extermination of one group by another. Riina decided not to waste time on negotiations. He chose the path of total annihilation of his opponents, and began methodically killing everyone who stood in his way. Several people were killed every day. They were shot in the streets, in cars, at home, in restaurants. Cars were blown up. They burst into homes and killed entire families. They spared no one, neither women, nor children, nor the elderly. If you were from an enemy clan or could simply become a threat someday, you were dead. Bodies were found everywhere, in car trunks, in roadside ditches, in garbage bins, cemented into concrete at construction sites. In 4 years, from 1,978th to 1,983rd, more than 1,000 people were killed. 1,000! This is not a war. It is genocide of some mafiosi by others. The methods became increasingly brutal. People disappeared without a trace. They were kidnapped, tortured, forced to say where the money was hidden, who their allies were, and then they were killed and dissolved in acid. No bodies, no evidence. Families waited for months, hoping the person had just gone into hiding. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. Riina was not just cruel, he was smart. He understood that in the mafia, the winner is not the strongest, but the most ruthless, the one who is ready to cross any boundaries, and he crossed them. He even killed those who were formerly on his side, if he suspected them of insufficient loyalty. He created an atmosphere of total fear, where everyone feared everyone, where no one could be trusted. By the beginning of the 1980s, Riina had won. He destroyed all his main opponents. The Palermo families were routed. Those who were not killed fled or submitted. Riina became the undisputed boss of bosses, the capo di tutti capi. His word was law. Disobeying meant death. Not only yours, but your whole family's. And under his leadership, the mafia turned into something completely new. This was no longer the traditional Cosa Nostra with its rituals and codes. It was a terrorist organization that held an entire region in fear, which demonstrated its strength through public murders, which feared nothing and no one anymore. But there was one problem. More precisely, several problems. Their names were judges. Because while the mafiosi were killing each other, the Italian state finally began to realize the scale of the disaster. People began to appear who decided to fight the mafia. Seriously, knowing that it would likely cost them their lives, but still doing their job. The first was Rocco Cinici, a senior judge from Palermo, a gray-haired, intelligent man who dedicated his entire life to the law. He began to coordinate investigations, uniting the fragmented efforts of the police and prosecutors. He understood what many did not want to understand, that the mafia is not a collection of separate criminals, but a single organization with a structure, hierarchy, and rules, and it needed to be fought accordingly. Cinici created a special group of investigators. He gathered the best, those who were not afraid, who were honest, who were not on the mafia's payroll. Among them were two young judges who would become symbols of the fight against the mafia, Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. childhood friends, both from Palermo, both knowing the Mafia not from textbooks, but from life, and both deciding to dedicate themselves to its destruction. But on the 29th of July, 1983rd year, Cinici was sitting in his car in front of his house. He started the engine, and the next second there was an explosion. A bomb packed with TNT and nails was placed under the car. The blast wave tore the car to shreds. Cinici died instantly. 2 of his bodyguards died with him. This was a message. The Mafia was showing we can kill anyone, even a senior judge, even in the center of Palermo, and we will get away with it. We are untouchable. But they miscalculated. Because Cinici's murder caused a wave of outrage, people took to the streets. For the first time in many years, Sicilians began speaking loudly against the Mafia. Newspapers wrote editorials. Politicians who had previously been silent began demanding action. The state realized something had to be done, otherwise the Mafia would take over everything. And Falcone and Borsellino continued their teacher's work. Moreover, they intensified it. Falcone developed a new investigative methodology. He started following the money. He understood that financial flows don't lie. You can kill all the witnesses, but bank transfers, accounts, deals, all this leaves traces. And by these traces, the entire structure of the Mafia could be reconstructed. Borsellino took a different path. He began working with pentiti, repented mafiosi, who decided to testify in exchange for protection and a reduced sentence. Omertà, the law of silence, began to crack. People saw that Riina's war spared no one, not even his own. And some decided that it was better to betray and stay alive than to keep silent and die. The first major pentito was Tommaso Buscetta, a high-ranking mafioso who lost almost his entire family in the war. Sons, brothers, nephews, all were killed by the Corleone clans. And Buscetta broke. He began to talk. He revealed everything, the structure of the Mafia, names, rituals, murders, financial schemes. His testimony formed the basis of the so-called Maxi trial, the largest judicial process against the Mafia in history. In the mid-1980s, the trial began in a specially constructed bunker in Palermo. In the dock, 474 mafiosi. Among them, the biggest bosses. The trial lasted 1 year. Buscetta testified from behind bulletproof glass. The defendants shouted, threatened, spat. Their lawyers tried to disrupt everything, to discredit the witnesses. But the court proceeded, and in 1987th year, the verdicts were handed down. 19 life sentences, hundreds of years in prison for the rest. It was a victory, the first true victory of the state over the Mafia in history, but the Mafia was not going to surrender. Riina declared war on the state itself. Not a secret guerrilla war, but an open one. A terrorist campaign that was supposed to force the authorities to retreat. And a series of assassination attempts began that would shock Italy and the whole world. About the Mafia's last furious attempt to retain its power. About the bloody finale of the confrontation. About the judges who knew they would be killed but did not back down. And about how Italy finally said no to the Mafia. War with the state and the arrest of Toto Riina, the 23rd of May, 1992nd year, Saturday, a sunny, warm day in Sicily. Giovanni Falcone returns from Rome to Palermo. With him are his wife Francesca and 3 bodyguards. Another normal workday awaits them. Papers, meetings, investigations. They don't know that this trip will be their last. The motorcade moves along the highway near the town of Capaci. The speed is high, the security is vigilant. safety, 3 armored cars. All precautions were taken. But the Mafia prepared more thoroughly. Half a ton of explosives was placed under the road in a drainage pipe. Half a ton. A man with a remote control sat on a hill and watched through binoculars, waited for the right moment, and when Falcone's car drew level with the correct spot, he pressed the button. The explosion was monstrously powerful. A piece of the highway the size of a football field literally vanished. A crater several meters deep formed. Falcone's car was thrown into the air and torn apart. Giovanni died instantly. Francesca died 2 hours later in the hospital. 3 bodyguards also did not survive. Another bodyguard survived, but was maimed for life. When the news reached Palermo, the city froze. People couldn't believe it. Falcone was a symbol of hope, a man who proved that the Mafia could be defeated, who never gave up, no matter what. And now he was killed, so demonstratively, so brazenly, so cruelly. The funeral turned into a popular demonstration. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets. They cried, shouted, demanded justice. For the first time in many years, Sicilians openly spoke out against the Mafia. Fear retreated before rage and grief. Posters appeared on buildings. Palermo demands the truth. Enough silence. The city woke up, but the Mafia did not stop, because Falcone was not alone. There was still his childhood friend, his comrade in the struggle, Paolo Borsellino. And after Falcone's death, Borsellino became the main target. He knew this, told friends, "They will kill me, it's a matter of time," but continued working, increased investigations, collected evidence, prepared new arrests. The 19th of July, 1992nd year, Sunday, less than 2 months after Falcone's death, Borsellino came to visit his mother, who lived in the center of Palermo on Via D'Amelio. With him were 5 bodyguards. They parked their cars near the house. Borsellino got out, headed for the entrance, and at that moment, a car packed with explosives blew up. Another monstrous explosion. Borsellino died instantly. Along with him, all 5 bodyguards. The facade of the house collapsed. People were thrown from windows by the blast wave. The street turned into a war zone. Italy was in shock. The 2 greatest anti-mafia fighters killed with a difference of 2 months. This was not just an assassination attempt, it was a challenge to the state. The Mafia seemed to say, "Look, we are stronger than you. We can kill anyone, even the most protected, the most famous, and we will get away with it." But the calculation failed, because public outrage reached such a fever pitch that the authorities simply could not remain inactive any longer. Troops were introduced into Palermo and other Sicilian cities. Mass arrests began. The police received emergency powers. Judges and prosecutors who previously feared getting involved with the Mafia now began working with doubled energy. And most importantly, the number of pentiti sharply increased. There were more and more repentant mafiosi. They saw that Riina had crossed the red line, that the murder of the judges had brought such anger from the state and society upon the Mafia that now it was the end for all of them. And they began to save their own skins by giving testimony. It was thanks to one of these pentiti that the trail of Riina was found. Toto the Beast had been hiding for more than 20 years. Officially, he had been wanted since the early 1970s, but they couldn't find him. He lived in Sicily, in Palermo, among his own, under the protection of silence and fear. The police knew he was somewhere here, but couldn't locate him. The 15th of January, 1993rd year, a special unit of carabinieri surrounded an unremarkable villa on the outskirts of Palermo. They burst inside, and there they found Riina, a stocky, middle-aged man in casual clothes. He didn't even try to resist. He just said, "You made a mistake. I am an honest businessman," playing his role until the very end. Riina's arrest became a sensation. The elusive beast was finally caught. The man who personally killed dozens of people and ordered the murder of hundreds, whom all of Sicily feared. There he was, in handcuffs, in newspaper photos, an ordinary, nondescript guy looking like a retiree, the banality of evil in its pure form. But the Mafia continued to act, because Riina was arrested, but the structure remained. His deputies were free. The money was still there, and they decided to continue the terrorist campaign to force the state to retreat, to force them to review the sentences, soften the prison regime for mafiosi, and stop the persecution. And the explosions began, not in Sicily, but on mainland Italy. The Mafia went beyond its traditional territory, showing that it could strike anywhere. This was real terrorism. The 27th of May, 1993rd year, an explosion destroyed a wing of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. 5 people died. Priceless works of art were destroyed. Italy wept. The Mafia had committed an outrage against something sacred, against cultural heritage. The 27th of July of the same year, explosions in Rome and Milan, churches and museums were bombed. Another 10 victims. Panic gripped the country. People were afraid to walk the central streets of cities, but this campaign had the opposite effect. The Mafia wanted to intimidate the state, but it intimidated society so much that society demanded decisive action. The authorities realized no compromises could be made. They had to press until the end, and the pressure intensified manifold. The second Maxi trial began, even larger than the first. Hundreds of defendants, thousands of volumes of materials, testimony from dozens of pentiti who revealed the structure of the Mafia, named names, described crimes. The Mafia resisted. Lawyers delayed the processes, intimidated witnesses, sought procedural loopholes, but the court went on. Riina received multiple life sentences for various cases, for various murders. He was placed in a special maximum security prison, the 41st Buys regime, where inmates are completely isolated from the outside world. No contacts, no possibility of relaying orders outside. Riina died in prison in 2017 year, never having regained his freedom. The beast died in a cage. Following Riina, other bosses were arrested, one after another. Thoroughly, methodically, they destroyed the structure, cut off financial flows, seized property. The state finally learned how to fight the Mafia with its own methods, patiently, persistently, without giving respite. In 2006 year, Bernardo Provenzano was arrested, the second man after Riina, the Tractor, as he was called. He had been hiding for more than 40 years. He lived in a rural hut, ate simply, and managed the Mafia through a system of notes, pizzini, which couriers delivered across the island. When he was captured, he did not resist. He just nodded. He understood the game was over. He died in prison 9 years later. By the end of the 1990s, it became clear that the Mafia had lost the war with the state. Yes, it had not disappeared, but the era of mass violence ended. The explosions stopped. Murders became rare. The Mafia went back into the shadows. But this was a different shadow, not menacing and omnipotent, but pathetic, creeping. The old code of honor completely died. Omertà turned into a fiction, Hundreds of pentiti spoke and spoke, giving up their former comrades. Rituals lost their meaning. The romantic image of the mafioso protector vanished forever. Only bandits, criminals, murderers remained. The mafia learned its lesson. Violence attracts attention. Attention attracts the state. And fighting the state is useless. It is stronger anyway. You have to act differently, quieter, less noticeable, through corruption, not through blood, through financial schemes, not through explosions. And the new generation of mafiosi began to build a new mafia, the mafia of the 21st century, where they don't shoot in the streets, but sign contracts in offices, where they don't blow up judges, but bribe officials, where the main weapon is not a pistol, but a calculator and a computer. But before we talk about this, we need to understand the mafia is not just Sicily. It is not just Cosa Nostra. Other criminal organizations exist in Italy, some even more powerful. Modern mafia structures, Camorra, 'Ndrangheta, Sacra Corona Unita. When people talk about the mafia, they usually imagine Sicily, Cosa Nostra, godfathers in black suits. But the truth is that the Sicilian mafia is only one part of the huge criminal world of Italy, and, perhaps, no longer even the most dangerous part. Because while Cosa Nostra was fighting the state and losing that war, other criminal organizations quietly grew, strengthened, and adapted to the new era. And today, they pose a much greater threat than the classic Sicilian mafia. Let's start with Naples, with the Camorra, the oldest, most chaotic, and possibly the most brutal of all Italian criminal organizations. The Camorra appeared back in the 17th century, long before the Sicilian mafia. It started in the prisons of Naples as a system of control among inmates. Then it moved on to the streets and turned into something unique. The main difference between the Camorra and Cosa Nostra is that it lacks a unified structure. No boss of bosses, no commission. It is not a pyramid, but a network. Dozens, hundreds of separate clans, each with its own territory, its own business, its own rules. They can unite for large operations. They can fight each other for control over a neighborhood. But there is no central leadership. This decentralization makes the Camorra almost invulnerable. Arrest one boss, nothing changes, another will take his place. Rout one clan, the others will continue to work. It's like a hydra. Cut off one head, two new ones grow. Naples and its surroundings, Campania, is one of the poorest regions of Italy. Unemployment, poverty, overcrowded slums where people live 10 to an apartment. An ideal environment for crime. And the Camorra controls everything here, from street drug trafficking to the garbage business. Yes, garbage. This is one of the Camorra's most profitable businesses. They control waste disposal throughout southern Italy. Only there is actually no disposal. The garbage is simply dumped in fields, buried in the ground, burned in the open air, including toxic industrial waste that they accept from northern companies for good money. As a result, entire regions are poisoned. Cancer rates are off the charts. The land cannot be used for agriculture, but the money flows. Drugs are another specialization. Naples is one of the main cocaine transit points in Europe, from South America across the Atlantic, then distribution throughout the continent. Camorra clans control ports, warehouses, transport chains. They work with Mexican cartels, with Colombians, with Albanians, an international network. And the violence here is more open than among the Sicilians. Shootouts in the streets in broad daylight. Teenagers on scooters with machine guns shoot competitors right in front of cafes. For them, this is normal. Life is worth nothing. A 14-year-old boy can kill a person for 100 euros and not blink an eye. There are neighborhoods in Naples where the police are afraid to enter. The Scampia district, for example, a huge residential complex built in the 1970s as social housing. It turned into a Camorra fortress, drug spots on every corner, lookouts on the roofs. If you try to enter without permission, you won't leave. The state has effectively lost control over these territories. The Italian writer Roberto Saviano wrote the book Gomorrah about the Camorra. He described their methods, named names, showed the scale of the problem. The book became a bestseller. A film and a TV series were made based on it, and Saviano received a death sentence from the Camorra. He has been living under 24-hour guard for more than 15 years, changes residence every few days, cannot walk the streets, cannot see friends freely. A living dead man, the price of truth. Now, let's move further south, to Calabria, the toe of the Italian boot. Here is based the 'Ndrangheta, possibly the most powerful criminal organization in Europe today, and yet the least known to the general public. The 'Ndrangheta arose around the same time as the Sicilian Mafia, also out of poverty and lawlessness. But it developed differently. If Cosa Nostra was built on hierarchy and rituals, the 'Ndrangheta is built on blood ties. It is a family organization in the literal sense. Clans consist of actual relatives, fathers, sons, brothers, nephews. Outsiders are not accepted. To betray the family means to betray blood. This makes the organization incredibly closed and stable. Calabria is the poorest region in Italy. Mountains, small villages where everyone knows everyone else. It is easy to hide here. Here, traditions are stronger than laws. And the 'Ndrangheta grew out of this soil, maintaining an archaic structure alongside modern methods. For a long time, the 'Ndrangheta remained in the shadow of the Sicilian Mafia, a local group controlling kidnappings and petty extortion. But in the 1980s and 1990s, when Cosa Nostra was fighting the state and falling apart, the 'Ndrangheta quietly seized the most profitable market, cocaine trafficking. Today, the 'Ndrangheta controls about 80% of the cocaine supply in Europe. 80%. They work directly with South American cartels. They have their own people in the ports of Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, their own distribution networks across the continent. Annual turnover is estimated at tens of billions of euros. That is more than the GDP of some countries, and yet they are almost invisible. They don't blow up judges. They don't stage public executions. They work quietly, methodically, professionally. They bribe the right people. They launder money through legal businesses. They invest in real estate throughout Europe. In Germany, entire neighborhoods belong to the 'Ndrangheta through dummy corporations, restaurants, hotels, construction firms. All this is a legal facade for dirty money. The family structure makes them virtually invulnerable to the police, because pentiti are almost non-existent here. To betray the 'Ndrangheta means to betray your own children, parents, brothers. Only a few are capable of this. Omertà still works here because it is based not on fear, but on blood. There is one more organization worth mentioning, Sacra Corona Unita, the Sacred United Crown, the youngest of the large Italian mafias. It appeared in Puglia, the heel of the Italian boot, only in the 1970s. According to legend, it was created by prisoners who were jailed alongside 'Ndrangheta members and adopted their methods. Sacra Corona Unita is a hybrid. It took its structure from the Calabrians, its cruelty from the Neapolitans, and its business acumen from the Sicilians. Its specialization is smuggling across the Adriatic Sea. Puglia is directly opposite the Balkans, a stone's throw from Albania, Montenegro, Croatia, and through these waters flow torrents, weapons, drugs, cigarettes, counterfeit products. And in the 1990s, during the wars in Yugoslavia, also refugees, entire ships packed with people who were brought to Italy for thousands of dollars per person. Sacra Corona Unita is closely linked to the Albanian Mafia and other Balkan criminal groups. It is an international network where the Italians secure the European market and the Balkan groups handle supplies. Their positions are especially strong in heroin trafficking. Afghan heroin goes through Turkey, the Balkans, and Puglia to Western Europe. But this organization is weaker than the others. Internal wars, arrests of leaders, pressure from the police, all this undermined its strength. Today, the Sacra Corona Unita is no longer the threat it was in the 1990s. Many believe that it is gradually dissolving, being absorbed by stronger competitors. So we see that Italian organized crime is not a monolith, but an ecosystem of different organizations with different structures, traditions, and specializations. And all of them have adapted to the 21st century. They have learned to survive under conditions where the state has become stronger, technology has given the police new tools, and society has stopped remaining silent. How do they do this? First, they have moved away from mass violence. They realized that murders attract attention. Now, violence is applied selectively, only when necessary. The rest of the time, a business approach. Second, deep integration into the legal economy. Mafia money is invested in restaurants, shops, transport companies, real estate. These enterprises operate legally, pay taxes, hire employees. But behind them stand criminal capital, and distinguishing legal business from criminal business is becoming almost impossible. Third, working with government contracts. This is a huge source of income. Road construction, waste disposal, supplying equipment for hospitals and schools, all this is funded by the state, and money can be made on all of it. The mafia creates dummy companies, wins tenders through corruption, inflates prices, uses substandard materials, and pays kickbacks to officials. A cycle of corruption. Fourth, new technologies. The mafia has mastered the internet, money laundering through cryptocurrencies, online drug trafficking through the darknet, cybercrime, hacking, fraud, data theft. The modern mafia hires programmers, hackers, financial analysts. They work in offices at computers, not on the streets with pistols. Fifth, globalization. The mafia is no longer limited to Italy. The 'Ndrangheta operates worldwide, in Germany, Canada, Australia. The Camorra controls drug trafficking from Latin America. They are all connected with other criminal organizations, Russian, Chinese, Mexican, Nigerian. This is a global network where nationality doesn't matter. Only money matters. And here we come to the main question. If the mafia has become so invisible, so integrated into normal life, so civilized, maybe it no longer poses a threat? Maybe it's just a form of doing business? No, because beneath the respectable facade remains the same rot, the same principles, violence, corruption, parasitism on society, only now it is packaged more nicely. The mafia has not disappeared or improved. It has just learned to hide, and the price of its existence is enormous. Billions of euros sucked out of the economy, thousands of lives ruined by drugs, poisoned land and water, youth who have no future because all jobs are controlled by clans, regions that cannot develop because any successful business is stifled by extortion, democracy undermined by corruption. This is what the modern mafia is, not the romantic godfathers from movies, but a cold criminal corporation that sucks the vitality out of society and poisons it from within. and which is possibly more dangerous than ever, precisely because it has become invisible. But is there a way to fight it? And why hasn't society definitively defeated this plague yet? So, we have come a long way. From the dusty Sicilian villages of the 19th century to modern financial schemes and cybercrime, we have seen the birth of the Mafia, its heyday, wars, defeats, transformations. But there is one more important topic we need to talk about. A topic that perhaps explains why the Mafia still exists, despite all efforts to destroy it. We are talking about how the Mafia lives in our consciousness, about the myth that surrounds it, about the romantic image created by cinema and literature, and about how this myth helps the real Mafia survive. The 24th of March, 1972nd year. The film that changed everything was released in American cinemas, The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola, an adaptation of Mario Puzo's novel about the Corleone Mafia family. The film became a cultural phenomenon. Box office receipts broke all records, critics were ecstatic, audiences left the theaters stunned. 3 Oscars, including Best Picture of the Year, a legend of cinema, a masterpiece. But there was one problem. The Godfather romanticized the Mafia. It showed it not as a gang of murderers and extortionists, but as a noble brotherhood living by a code of honor. Don Vito Corleone, played by Marlon Brando. He is not a bandit. He is a wise patriarch who cares for his people, helps the poor, and dispenses justice where the state is powerless. His son Michael is not a criminal, but a tragic hero forced to take on the burden of the family. Yes, they kill, but they kill beautifully, with dignity, by the rules, and the viewer begins to sympathize with them. Critics immediately saw the danger. Alexander Karaganov noted that the film affects viewers with such force that they begin to empathize with the main characters, while the victims of the Mafia recede into the background. Archpriest Alexei Uminsky wrote, "Such wonderful films as The Godfather, in essence, continue the theme of the romanticization of evil. For no matter how it looks on screen, it is obvious that the reality is completely different. And God forbid that in real life one should fall into one of those situations shown in these films. There is no romance in the bullet-riddled bodies of loved ones." But viewers did not want to see reality. They wanted the myth of strong men who do not bow down to the system, of a family where you will always be supported, of a world where clear rules apply. You are loyal to the family is loyal to you. In an era when traditional values were eroding, when the state seemed like a soulless machine, the Mafia, as portrayed by Coppola, looked like an island of humanity and honor. Coppola himself understood this contradiction. He said, "For me, the subject of multi-layered research was the Mafia as an idea, as a metaphor, as well as the ways in which it operates in government, in business. Obviously romanticize the Mafia by showing the bosses as petty, neurotic, ridiculous people. But even these attempts to debunk the myth did not fully succeed, because the image was too strong, too attractive. In Italy, the film Gomorrah was released, based on Roberto Saviano's book about the Neapolitan Camorra. Here there is no romance at all. It shows ordinary bandits, stupid, greedy, cruel. They kill children, mutilate innocents, poison the land, reality without embellishment. But even after this film, many young Italians wanted to become mafiosi because they saw the money, the cars, the power, and they didn't notice the price, ruined lives, fear, death, or believed it wouldn't affect them. You see what the problem is? Cinema created an alternative reality, a reality where the Mafia is cool, where the heroes have money, spectacular women, respect on the streets, where they have strict moral principles, Do not touch children. Do not betray your own. Keep your word. A beautiful picture that hides the rotting corpses and mutilated destinies. And what about the real mafia? It uses this myth. Young guys are lured in precisely through it. Look how real men live. Do you want the same? Join the family. And they join, not understanding that they are entering hell from which there is no exit. That in a few years they will either be killed or imprisoned. The mafia gives it to them. Not for long, until the first bullet or the first arrest. 20 years is the age at which youth gang bosses are now emerging. Children command children, and they die like children, suddenly, senselessly, early. But there is another side, because not all Italians are silent. An anti-mafia movement has emerged, people who openly speak out against the mafia despite the risk. The Libera Association, founded by the priest Don Luigi Ciotti, unites thousands of activists. They run educational programs in schools, telling children the truth about the mafia, without romance, without embellishment. Explaining that the mafia is not the protection of the weak, but a parasite that sucks the vitality out of society. Youth movements organize marches in memory of murdered judges and journalists. Graffiti featuring the portraits of Falcone and Borsellino appears on the walls of houses. People stop paying the pizzo, the mafia tribute, and publicly state this. Entrepreneurs unite to collectively resist extortion. This requires incredible courage, because the mafia does not forgive open defiance. But people are no longer afraid, or they are afraid, but still act. The state has also changed its approach. Now, anti-mafia education classes are held in schools in Sicily, Calabria, and Campania. Children are explained what the mafia truly is. They are shown documentaries, invited pentiti who tell their stories, how they got into the mafia, what they experienced, how they broke free, how they lost friends, family, life itself in the conventional sense. Property confiscated from the mafia is transferred to social cooperatives. On lands that previously belonged to the bosses, young farmers now grow organic products and sell them under the label liberated lands. Villas are turned into schools and assistance centers. This is symbolic. What the mafia stole from society is returned to society, and consciousness is slowly changing, especially among the younger generation. They increasingly see the mafia not as a romantic ideal, but as a disgrace. They are ashamed that their region is known not for culture and beauty, but for crime. They want a different life, and they are building it, despite all the difficulties. But the fight is far from over, because the mafia adapts faster than society can react. It moves out of sight, masks itself, penetrates the legal economy so deeply that pays tribute for peace of mind, votes for politicians who are connected with the mafia, raises children in an atmosphere where it's normal not to trust the police, normal to resolve problems by the code, normal to keep silent about crimes. To break this silence, that means defeating the mafia, not in the sense of arresting all the bosses. New ones will take their place, but in the sense of changing the culture in which the mafia is rooted, creating a society where people are not afraid to speak the truth, where youth sees judges, teachers, entrepreneurs who work honestly as heroes, not bandits in expensive suits, where success is measured not by money at any cost, but by dignity and integrity. This is a long road, the road of generations, but it has begun. And everyone who refuses to pay tribute, who testifies against the mafia, who tells children the truth, who simply lives honestly in a world where dishonesty has become the norm, takes a step on this road. The mafia is not just a criminal organization, it is a disease of society. a symptom of deeper problems: poverty, injustice, corruption, lack of prospects. And the illness must be treated, not the symptom. Create jobs so that young people do not have to join bandits. Build an honest justice system so that people do not have to seek alternative justice. Cultivate a culture of respect for the law, not for force. We began this story in the 19th century in Sicily, where a small group of local authorities settled petty disputes between peasants. We passed through a century of ups and downs, across oceans and continents, through wars and revolutions. And we have come to today, when the mafia has become global, invisible, integrated into the very fabric of society. But the story continues, because the fight is not over. Every day someone makes a choice: to remain silent or to speak the truth, to submit or to resist, to accept the system or to try to change it. And the future depends on these daily choices of millions of people. The mafia is not immortal. It exists only because we allow it to exist. And the moment society says a firm no to it, not in words, but in deeds, it will disappear. Not immediately, not easily, but it will disappear. Until then, the story will continue, and it will have new chapters about new essence. The history of the mafia is a mirror in which humanity itself is reflected, with all its weaknesses and strengths, with the capacity to create evil and the capacity to resist it. And everyone who reads or hears this story must ask themselves, whose side am I on? What am I willing to do? What am I willing to talk about? Because the mafia lives not where they shoot. It lives where they are silent.